Welcome to Small Talk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of Small Talk, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Daniel Fine, who is Director of Education for Seed in London, a Rabbi and an author of a number of books. And this episode of Small Talk will be discussing his new book titled Building Blocks, Exploring Pivotal Texts in Jewish Philosophy, Sources, Translations, Explanations, and Discussions, published by Adir Press. Thank you, Rabbi Fine, for joining me.
Nice to be here.
What can you tell the listeners about this book?
Yeah, okay. So, true, it's like many Sfarim, many books, I guess, across history. This is a bit of a personal journey, meaning both when I was growing up and when I was a Rabbi, I kind of really warmed towards, I would call them nuggets of clear hashkafa in a sequential way. In other words, we grow up with all sorts of little bits of ideas about different parts of Yiddishkeit and Judaism and growth. And I felt to have them in a systematic way that A could be studied and B could be taught, was like crucial. I saw it in my own teaching as well. So, not just, I know like a tiny little bit about Emunah, but kind of really explained, really defined, really brought home. The same with any given other things that are in the book, bitachon and free will and reward and punishment, to get a real understanding of what they are in a clear way with the guided questions and translations and sources. So that was a nugget, that was a nutshell, and that was the goal, to be honest, as well.
When we say with the subtitle Jewish philosophy, how do you at least define Jewish philosophy, and especially as it pertains to this book?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's funny. People see like on the cover, pivotal text Jewish philosophy. They feel it's like this, like up in the clouds. You have to read 400 pages and then work out, do you really exist? Do you know what I mean? So it's not that. It's much more grounded than that. It's much more practical Jewish philosophy. In other words, answering the questions that actually impact your life. Do free will? What does emunah mean? What does tefillah mean? How that works? Almost the cogs of all the practical elements of Jewish philosophy.
So usually I ask later on towards the end of the episode for sources, but I think it's important here right at the outset to say, this is you're translating, you're selecting different sources and you're going through and different, what type of sources, especially as it pertains to the topic of Jewish philosophy, are you using in this book?
Yeah, okay, really important. So there's nothing what I would call off the beaten track. You're talking about the typical standard, a bit funny to call them standard, you know what I mean? Rishonim, Achronim, the names that we would all know, your Rashis, your Rambams, etc., Ritvos, and then later on your Marshals, Chazanish, etc., a bit of Rodesla. It's a real mix, only because when I was learning and in yeshiva for various years, Baruch Hashem, I had the opportunity to learn kind of real mix. In terms of Rishonim, Achronim, etc., in these areas. So it reflects that to an extent, but there's nothing off the beaten track. I'd call it nothing controversial. The one thing that I was quite makpid on, is as follows. Like I saw a lot of Sfarim on these kind of topics. I felt either they're very conversational. It's all in English. It's easy reading. You sit back on the couch, you lie down in a good way. You know what I mean? Or they're Sfarim that are really in depth, but like each topic is like 500 pages. So I wanted to make sure that this one took someone through the sources, so they felt it was authentic, real. They were learning it for themselves, but yet was bite-sized enough that it doesn't need to be like 500 pages per topic.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the topics included here. I mean, I can list some of them. You can also list some of them. So you have Emunah, and then bitachon, trust in Hashem, Tefillah, why did Hashem create the world, free will, olam haba, miracles and hashkacha, why bad things happen to good people, tests and challenges, the Jewish people, future focus, mitzvahs, midos, potential and personal growth, the oral law. And I just read the main headers. There are a lot of subheaders, and I'm not reading all of them here. So if you want to expound a little bit how you picked those specific topics.
Yeah. So firstly, it sounds like you read the whole book. Well done. At least the content.
Or I just read off the table of contents. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, why that? And I guess part of that is what is the order. It's funny. Initially, I was following more or less the order of the Yud Gimel Ikrim. I don't want to call it a safe on the Yud Gimel Ikrim because who am I to write on the Yud Gimel Ikrim? But it's basically that idea. In other words, first you're talking about the basics of Hashem existing, then it's how He is relating to us. In other words, you've got why did Hashem create the world? You've got free will, olam haba, and then what I would call is the real practical a chapter about the Jewish people, the uniqueness of Klal Yisrael, and then mitzvahs, and giving reasons for mitzvahs, looking at different mitzvahs and what their reasons are, whether it's tefillin or Shabbos, whether it's tzedakah, whether it's Shema, Talmud Torah. So it basically became, I'd say, it started in Shamayim and moved towards the Aretz, if you know what I mean. Initially, it's funny, I had a whole chapter on Nevuah. At one point, I got very much into learning about Nevuah, and I had a whole chapter on it. And someone turned to me and said, "Do you really think people are going to learn 50 pages about Nevuah?" I said, halavai, but I took it out.
Okay, so maybe you want to give some examples, especially the way the book is structured. You have framing, you have the way, to walk through, like give an example. You can pick any examples you want to give, or just explain maybe a chapter and how it works.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So each chapter begins with kind of guided questions. So people aren't tackling the sources kind of just totally without any framing. So you've got guided questions. They can be used in a classroom. They can be used even studying by yourself. I'll give you an example in a chapter soon. Then you've got the Makoros themselves, and they all have vowels for people who need them. They're all translated. Then you've got the weaving between the Makoros, and sometimes how each one relates to the other. And then towards the end, you've got summaries. And right at the end of each chapter, you've got what I took advice from someone. I think this is quite a nice touch. They said to me, it has to really hit home. It can't just be abstract, even with the questions. It has to be real. So we included almost like a bring it home at the end, which was little vignettes of kind of biographical sketches about who wrote the Makoros, and also who was the Malbim, who was the Rambam, who was the Rashi, 3-4 lines, just so people know, and then a few stories just to kind of really bring it home. So just an example, let's take Emunah, it's the first one. So within Emunah, you've got your subsections. We've got the issues to think about. In other words, what difference does Emunah make to my life? If I have someone doing mitzvahs without Emunah, how does that stack up? Is Emunah received? Is it innate? Is it proven? Etc. All the kind of real questions that people who really want to understand and grow with it ask. And then you've got your chapter, mini chapter headings. So you've got, the greatness of Emunah. Why is Emunah important? The definitions of Emunah. What is included in the mitzvah. And then as you go through, you've got your ways to build Emunah, you've got whether Emunah needs to be investigated, needs to be proved, etc., and how you build on that, and then different levels of Emunah. But that will be a typical chapter.
Got it. And each one there's questions, and then you discuss it and you go through it. And as you say, also there are also activities for classroom. So can you explain what does that mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Firstly, what's a classroom? That's the only thing we don't define. What's a classroom? Okay, so I felt this could be a really useful classroom resource. Again, I used to teach this to kids who are 16, 17. Even though I feel the book, people ask what's the age range? I say really a mature teenager all the way up to someone late 20s, etc., who really appreciates for learning these topics in a structured way. I just felt like if it is going to be used in a classroom setting, there needs to be at least one page per chapter that kind of really brings it into the classroom. So we've got different activities, different discussions that teachers and Rabbeim, etc., can use for their classroom. I felt that would be useful for that. Of course, we had to build a box and put it in grey because it's for some people, it's not for everyone. You know what I mean? But I felt that was also an important part of how we do things. And it also in terms of Makoros, I wrote this in the introduction. Not all, I would say 95% of Makoros are translated. There's 5% that are either really difficult or someone really needs to learn kind of with their teacher, with their Rebbe. There's a whole section about Chazal and the role of Chazal, and which a lot of it is purposefully not translated. Just the importance of learning that with your Rebbe. The things you're going to have questions on, making sure that you have someone guiding you on that as well. I also added, again, it's in the introduction, that I didn't use loads of likud for him. In other words, if you look at the Sefer, you say, hey, why doesn't he mention that Makar? It's very simple. Maybe I haven't come across that Makar, or, I didn't, it would have taken years, and then you'd have got into the really difficult, situations and kind of dilemmas to include that and not that. So when one of the Rishonim has made a point, I don't necessarily, sometimes in the footnotes, but in the main text, I don't say, and there are 20 other Rishonim who say exactly the same. And bring them all. And that's just going to make the book much too long, and ultimately it's not going to be digestible that way.
And also at the end of the chapter, there's a lot of ways that make this book practical. You have, as you said, making it real, and you have the classroom option. You also have at the end, you have a summary, and you also have who did we learn from in this chapter. And you have the Ramchal or the Chinuch, the Ikrim. You'll have that type of thing. You have a short synopsis of each opinion, which is nice, and it's like bullet pointed with each one. So it's not just like lumped together, one paragraph synopsis. You can make it very clear, laid out. Now, you mentioned the translations. Were those translations done by you, or you took from existing translations? How'd you do the translations?
Yes, it's funny. A lot of the important things in life, details really come to the fore, right? As you have a bigger picture plan, I want to do this. And then when it gets down to details, okay, like, how do I do that? So interestingly, the two biggest things that took the most time were the vowels. And I was making sure the vowels were all right, and it was all correct. So adding the right vowels to the Hebrew, again, for people who need that. So the translations, I didn't copy and paste. I didn't take off the internet, anything like that. And for a few reasons. Firstly, there's Yashrus, and secondly, it's not always accurate. So I did the translation myself, basically.
I was going to say, that's a lot of work to do all these translations.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. And also the layout on the page has to be really clear. In other words, where does, the makar and then the translation, which is normally italics, and then the bullet point afterwards, either discussing it or asking a question. It all has to be laid out very well. Baruch Hashem, the person who did the design, really did a good job of the layout. I've had a lot of people feeding back saying like they did a really, really good job on the layout. It's easy to read, it's clean, it's clear. I'm sure others throw more as well. It's not unique. But, especially in these kind of, it sounds like where you got loads of Makoris together, it can look like massive, inhibiting Makoris sheet. Very scary. But Baruch Hashem, this is laid out well and clear.
So as you explained, it follows the Yod Gimel Erkim. So is it the type of sefer that you have to go in order, or can someone just open it up and, pick any chapter?
Yeah, good question. They can really pick any chapter. I'd say maximum impact is when you start from the beginning, because just you're building in terms of your growth from the basic, that's why it's called building blocks, right? The best way is the beginning. But you can definitely learn enough from each chapter by itself, 100%. Like you can jump into free will without necessarily talking about, Emunah and Bitachon. Right, you can jump into that. You can jump into reward and punishment without that as well. You can jump into why the bad things happen to good people without all the other things that came before that. If you want to understand a chapter or a topic in isolation, that's perfectly doable.
Was there one specific topic that for you personally was the most enjoyable to research or write? Or enjoyable, I don't know if the right word is enjoyable here for a heavy topic, but, because as you mentioned, this is really a personal journey that you're trying to give to everyone, which is really, like you said, most books are really.
Yeah. So I asked so much feedback from so many people. I can't tell you how many times I thought this one would send the manuscript here. It would get printed beforehand. I sent it to so many people, young, old, Rabbeim, different places in the world just to get feedback. Because I was so into it myself, I felt there was a risk. It would just be like an expression of me and what I like. And the topics that I like. So I got a lot of feedback. It's going to sound cliche, but the topic that I enjoyed the most was whichever topic I was doing at the time. In other words, when I got to free will and all the Bechira stuff, was like unreal. I was very into it. And it had to be Bechira versus destiny, and Bechira if Hashem knows the future, and what's the definition of Bechira? Can I do everything, and why Bechira? And then I got to the reasons for mitzvahs a few chapters later, where we were going through whether you can give reasons for mitzvahs, whether, what are reasons for mitzvahs, individual mitzvahs. And I got very, very much into that as well. I sound like an excited teenager, right? So each topic, to be honest, at the time was the most exciting topic. I have to say the publisher, who did really well, because every time in my own learning I came across a new makar, I excitedly emailed him saying, is the book closed? Can I add something? You know what I mean? And one of my Rosh Yeshiva, famously didn't publish many Sfarim because he was constantly perfecting his shirim.
You hear that at Bavaria's Gedolim over the years. They didn't print the Sfarim because they wanted to be perfect, and they always felt it wasn't perfect.
Yeah. So whenever I came across, I've even got a few of these topics. I look now and I think, I really should have included that makar had I known at the time.
Who would you say the book is for?
It's a really good question. So if I give an age and stage, I think it will limit it because it's not really an age and stage per se. I would say anyone who wants to know more about these key topics and wants to see them from the sources without being overwhelmed. So if I need to give an age and stage, you're talking about mature teenagers who in a classroom or even by themselves can research these topics. You're talking about people who are making their first steps in Jewish growth. who could really do with the clarity of what does Yiddishkeit have to say about these key areas. And then, to be honest, you're talking about some people who grew up, I would say, generally learning, generally from, who probably don't have some of whom don't have a key handle on some of these topics. Because you ask them, like, what is, how does Yiddishkeit view reward and punishment? What is Olam Haba? You know what I mean? Like, if they can't say it, then this is a sefer that certainly will speak to them. Even I had a chapter about, it's called Future Focus, just things about Mashiach, Beis Hamikdash, the third Beis Hamikdash, difference between the two Batei Mikdash, just things that I'd say are really, really important, just in terms of our hashkafa, in terms of our knowledge. And that's why we call it building blocks. Building blocks, on the one hand, it showed a certain, building blocks, it's only building blocks. There's more to learn. This is the scaffolding, this is the skeleton. On the other hand, you've got to have your building blocks to build the building.
What are you trying to accomplish with this book?
Yeah, another good question. You've done this before, hey? In an ideal world, I would love for this to be used in like high schools. In other words, I'd say 16 to 17-year-olds, who are going to create a syllabus and really in a methodical way teach these. I just feel it gives tremendous clarity to those formative years. So it's not limited to that, but that would be in an ideal world. Schools using them, giving them out to on graduation, etc. Again, for the right level, for people who can appreciate this. But I just, again, it's the clarity in these topics. The difference between growing up, again, whatever level growing up is, everyone says I'm growing up, right? Growing up with clarity on these issues and topics in hashkafa, it's just a different world. When things are clear, it's a different world. We see it in the weather. I'm English, so we mentioned the weather, right? When the world is like sunny and it's nice and the air is clear and it's all blue sky, you react in a certain way. You live life in a certain way, right? When it's hazy and dark and foggy and misty, then you unfortunately react in a different way, right? So our belief systems, our hashkafas, our constructs, our emunah is totally like that, just on an infinite level. If things are clear, we live life with that clarity. If things are hazy, then we're bouncing from place to place without any clear mahalach.
I'll link to the book in the show notes. It's available on Amazon, it's available in Sfarim stores, Audio Press, and so on. So I'll link to it for those interested in purchasing it, can purchase it. And thank you, Rabbi Fine, for joining me.
Pleasure, thank you.